It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Paul Pullman to the Etipu stage. Paul, it is so great to see you. Welcome to the BOMA New Zealand Agri Summit.
Well, thank you, Carla. It's an honor to be here, and what you do as BOMA is quite incredible.
Paul, you talk so much about purpose. Why is purpose important?
Well, purpose. If you talk about purpose, Colin Meyer just wrote this book called Prosperity, and he talks about to profitably address the issues of people and planet. We live in a very uncertain world right now. Some say there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are days that decades happen. And I think that is what you see right now. We're in the midst of probably one of the biggest shifts that we have seen in the history of humanity, and certainly it's going fast. And where purpose comes in, obviously, it gives you a different, a certain meaning, a beacon, or what Bill George calls a true north. Mark Twain said there are two important moments in life, the moment that you were born and when you found out why you were born. And most people actually want to make a difference, want to have a bigger impact, want to leave this world in a better place, want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And this is obviously where purpose comes in. And it's clear that during these times when many of the issues have surfaced in society, that people that have that stronger beacon, that true north or that direction that we talked about, are better able to deal with these levels of uncertainty.
And I'm sure there are a lot of people in the Etsipu audience who um, are thinking, this all sounds great. I would love to do that. But I'm dealing with the financial realities of my business or my farm. And it's great to have a commitment to purpose when you've got the resources of a huge multinational organization behind you. I don't see how I could possibly afford to make any kind of investment in purpose. So my question is, what would you say to them? And I guess more specifically, does purpose pay?
Well, I would say purpose pays increasingly. It's never black and white, but this notion that there is a trade-off between purpose and profit is increasingly proven wrong. In fact, we looked at 1,000 companies in the Russell Index in the United States, and we found that companies that were run under a multi-stakeholder, longer-term platform, putting purpose at their core, were also the companies that actually were significantly more profitable versus their peers. And you see that happening in industry sectors as well. It motivates employees, it attracts the right people to work for you, it strengthens your relationships in your value chain, it makes you more innovative, and obviously, ultimately, that gets related into results. Companies that operate under a principle that is more than what you would call shareholder primacy often are companies that are more resilient. And we've certainly seen that during COVID. We saw a clear bifurcation happening in the market. Companies that were run under this ESG, environmental, social governance principle, were actually companies that were performing better. And not surprisingly, we're also seeing the financial market starting to move into that direction. ESG funds by far have outperformed non-ESG funds, and the flow of money that went into it has never been so high. So I think the world has woken up. And the reason for that really is that many of these basic challenges that we see out there now of climate change, of food security, of poverty or inequality, of racial tension, if I may call it that way, have all come to the surface even more so than before. And people increasingly are realizing the enormous costs that we have, the cost to the social cohesion, the cost to society, but also the cost in the business models itself. And turning that around is really addressing these issues has become a big, very big opportunity, and also a financially attractive opportunity, not just for the big companies, but also for the smaller companies. In fact, it are the smaller companies that often are more agile, closer to the markets and consumers, and able to pivot faster than these bigger companies. But let me just pull out one or two statistics to make my point here. Um, COVID has cost the economy about $22 trillion in lost economic benefit, if you want to, or GDP. We've put in $16 trillion with the governments combined to save lives and livelihoods. Absolutely needed. But the reality is most of that could have been prevented. And implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which would get to the core of addressing these basic fundamental human tragedy issues, if you want to, would only cost us $2 to $3 trillion a year. So we're at the moment right now in humanity where the cost of not acting is actually becoming significantly higher than the cost of acting. So companies that understand that, governments that understand that, I think will position them well for the future, and will have a better economic return if you're driven by that, than the others that continue to neglect this. We've never been so forewarned about what is going to happen, and frankly also so forearmed with tools to do something about it. And yet we're in a state of paralysis when you look at it. The SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, have a simple objective to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. And some people simply paraphrase that as leaving no one behind. It's by all means possible. If you look at each of the goals right now, the cost on each of the goals are actually higher already than the combined cost of implementing all the Sustainable Development Goals. That makes it so surprising that we are so paralyzed. I take very quickly goal number 13, which is climate action. We're incurring $5 to $6 trillion a year already just on climate. Goal number 5, gender equality, by not giving equal rights, land rights, educational access, financing to women versus men, we're locking up $24 trillion. Goal number 16, peace and justice. With the conflict prevention and wars that we have in this world, we're spending $8 to $10 trillion on actually dealing with the adverse consequences that we should have avoided in the first place. And I've not even talked about COVID and the pandemics. So the SDGs are a really great framework because they're the roadmap, and more companies are actually orienting themselves towards the SDGs to find opportunities. And whilst the financial crisis 10 years ago, we missed that opportunity. At that time, banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. We totally forgot on investing in addressing some of these basic issues: climate change, inequality, food security. This time it's quite different. COVID has really brought to life not only the interdependence between biodiversity, climate change, human health, racial dimension, and the economy, but it has also shown us that you cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And increasingly, we see governments now starting to understand that. Despite the difficulties in multilateralism, the difficulties with populist and nationalist, in some cases xenophobic governments, we are starting to now see the 8 to 10 biggest governments, out of the 10 biggest governments, making net zero commitments on climate. Your government with Yassine is probably one of the most forward-thinking or progressive ones, actually embedding it into law and taking actions already, quite significant actions, short-term and not only the longer-term promises. But the world is starting to move. In Europe, you have the Green Deal, you have the Farm to Fork package, the biodiversity package. You see the US now putting significant money into regenerative farming. Nature-based solutions is coming on the agenda. And it's partly driven by the situation we find ourselves in. COVID has given us this moment of pause or reflection. But it is also because people are starting to realize that we cannot just go on. There is no infinite growth on a finite planet. We cannot continuously deal with these issues that are out there. So governments are starting to implement for a simple reason. They're finding out that greening their societies by building back better, as people say, they're not only creating a more resilient economy, an economy that is oriented towards the future, but they're actually also creating more jobs and better jobs and addressing the issues of inequality. And the financial market is catching on to this quite rapidly, actually. And so are the citizens of this world. And companies would be well served to adapt. What I think we're past the point that we have to explain to people why this is needed. And the whole attention should now be focused on the how. Unfortunately, whilst we're moving in the right direction, we simply aren't moving at the speed and scale that is needed. So all of our efforts need to go there. And 2021 is a very important year, and this decade is a very important decade of delivery. In 2021, we have the Food Summit, we have the Climate Summit, we have the Biodiversity Summit, or COP15 in Kunming in China. These are very important milestones now that we need to use to step up to the plate. John Kerry, especially in the US, has called a lot of people together, and you will see in the coming 24 hours quite some significant commitments coming out, especially on climate, but may I also say on nature-based solutions. So what is missing? Why aren't we moving? We're not moving because first and foremost, we're not changing the boundaries of our economic system. We're dealing with the symptoms, but often don't address the underlying causes. We need to move these boundaries, financial market to the long term, regenerative economies or circular economies, more equal tax systems and inclusive policies. They're not happening at the right speed. And the second reason, I think, which is equally important that you alluded to, it's really the human willpower. You have to simply ask yourself the question, do we care? We know how to produce food without cutting down the forests, yet we continue to cut them down and as if it doesn't matter. We know how to build houses, yet the number of homeless go up. We also know how to build toilets. Still 1.5 billion people open defecation. So do we really care is basically the question. And unfortunately, I think we have to see this leadership transition moving away from the Milton Friedman doctrine of shareholder primacy to people that have a broader purpose, social conscious, and are better equipped to handle these broader issues.
Do you see incentives at a global scale realigning in order to make it more compelling for people to act on some of these big issues, for large organizations to act on some of these big issues?
Yeah, you're addressing rightfully so some of these major bottlenecks that are there. And one of them is that we're chasing the wrong objectives, and you've been referring to that. This whole notion of GDP is a wrong notion. When Simon Kushnick invented this in the 40s as a measure, it was really meant to be a measure of industrial output. He said never use this to decide what the well-being of a country is. It doesn't measure income inequalities. It doesn't measure the negative externalities, et cetera, et cetera. So we do need to change our systems. And there is a major effort going on now with the International Financial Reporting Standard Board that is creating a sustainable standard board where we start to measure increasingly also not only the return on financial capital, but also the return on social and environmental capital. Not surprisingly, many people are, for example, calling on the price on carbon. And countries or jurisdictions that have put a price on carbon are not only decarbonizing faster, they're actually also more resilient and more competitive. And there's many data points on that and evidence of that. So the first thing we need to do is change our measurement system, and as you would call it, what we measure as success. So these efforts are happening, but they're obviously slow. Interestingly now, Europe has the European taxonomy, is setting standards, of what ESG is trying to attack the issues of greenwashing. And now it's the new government in the US. The SEC is starting to jump on this as well. So I believe you will see more movement in this area. The second thing you will see is that countries have figured out that they have a bigger role to play. Despite the difficulties of working together, they've really come together on climate change. And we're really starting to see momentum. Not enough yet. Promises that are sometimes too far out. We need to get commitments between now and 2030. But there is real movement on climate change. And that is setting a clear direction. Paris already set a direction, but this now is being accelerated. So we're also happy about that. Where we are falling short, I think, is really translating all these commitments into concrete actions at the speed and scale that is needed. And this is why it is so important that we ask governments to make clear commitments in the coming decade, why we ask companies to make commitments that are earlier. Increasingly, we see this, but we certainly need to accelerate it still. One area that is under-prioritized, which is absolutely crucial and important also for your audience, is nature-based solutions. Our food system is broken from all dimensions. If you would come in from Mars, you'd think we are nuts. And our food system obviously permeates all the elements of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're keeping 900 million people in chronic hunger, or we have 160 million kids stunted by not giving them enough nutrition. We waste 30 to 40% of the food. We cut down the lungs of this world, the forest to produce it. 25% of global emissions is in our food chain. And on the other side, we have a billion people obese, causing one of the biggest epidemics of diabetes too. So this whole system is bizarre, and yet it has to become a part of the solution. 30% of the solution to climate change actually comes from nature-based solutions, which basically in broad terms is our food system. So we do want governments, we do want companies to put far more attention to that. It's starting to happen slowly but surely. Companies like Nestle have made a commitment approved by their shareholders this week of about $4 billion to go behind nature-based solutions. Companies like Unilever, Microsoft, Walmart have major initiatives because they realize, and most businesses now realize, how much their business models depend on nature and how many services nature provides. And it is in their interest. And the farmers would obviously have to play a key role in that as well. Farmers that are increasingly positioned around regenerative farming, restoring nature, providing these nature-based solutions and protections will be the farmers, I believe, that are well positioned for catering to the demands of the citizens of this world, but also of the companies that produce finally the products. And there are some challenges to overcome. One of them that you clearly mentioned is the different power balances in the value chain. One making the investments, the other one's reaping the benefits, and that needs to be addressed. Sometimes that can be addressed by frameworks and legislation, and sometimes that needs to be addressed by different forms of partnership. There will not be one answer, and a lot of that has to happen in the local communities because it's such a unique local problem in many cases that you cannot simplify by broad global solutions. But for example, one of the things we're fighting now is there are about $600 billion of per forest subsidies in agriculture that actually make things worse, not better. Can we convince the countries, just like we've done on carbon subsidies, can we convince these countries to redirect these subsidies to the farmers, creating a better social contract with them, giving them better livelihoods, helping them in this transition? And likewise, many companies have made net zero commitments in their value chain, which means that they've taken responsibilities beyond their own operations into their total footprint in the world. But some of them, most of the carbon exposure of a company like Unilever or Nestle or any other is actually in their value chain. So they are desperately looking for carbon credits and offsets, desperately looking to turning their value chain into a carbon positive value chain. Otherwise, they will be out of business. So they're willing to invest in farmers, in carbon credits, creating different standards that allow them to operate for generations to come.
Okay, so if we were to be able to shift New Zealand so that our agriculture industry, our farming industry was carbon positive, then we could have an incredible market advantage with companies like Unilever, where we not only have a ready customer for our products, but we have an additional ability to support them in the need to address their supply chain carbon impact.
And I think you're ready for that. There are many things that can be done in terms of nature-based services, in terms of different feeding methods, which is a key issue for your country, to reduce the methane gas emissions, etc. And companies will be able to look for that. But more importantly, these carbon markets are being developed. You can monetize that. Now, we recognize there's no question that many of these farmers have a problem in the transition. Who is going to finance that transition, because the farmers often don't have the financial means to do that. And in their lifetime, they only have 50 or 60 shots at a crop. Can they take that risk of that conversion to sustainable agriculture, which sometimes takes a few years? So we need to reward farmers for ecosystem services. We need to pay them for that. We need to provide far more credit and insurance to farmers. Now, although it's 30% of the solution to climate change, it only attracts 2 to 3% of the funds. We need to have extension services, agronomists, and others bringing in the best knowledge and R&D that is available. And then obviously we need to work on the consumer side. Consumers are changing. The market for organic or bio is the only market in food that is growing. The rest is actually going down. But we need to accelerate that trend. So can we get consumer habits to change around healthier food? Diversifying the crops that we have in this world. There are very few crops, 5 or 6 crops now, monocrops that basically are degrading the land. We've degraded the size of Latin America, and the story continues. Can we do crop diversification that also results in healthier food? Can we provide incentives to change consumer habits that will help the farmers? But all of that has to be done by putting the farmers in the center. Most of the people that live in poverty in this world are smallholder monocrop farmers. They might not be in New Zealand, but there are an awful lot in the rest of the world. So if we don't change the way we farm, the way we reward farmers, the way we ask farmers to provide these incredible nature-based services, we will not even get close to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals or attacking even an issue like climate change itself.
I'm going to take some questions from our audience. We've got questions coming in through the Q&A, and the first one comes from Boma Germany. Obviously, Paul, you have a view into senior leadership at large organizations, major organizations. What in your mind needs to be done to change the mindset of more leaders in those organizations so that they're kind of singing off the same song sheet that you are?
Rutger Bregman is a Dutchman, a fellow Dutchman of mine, wrote a book, Humankind, and it basically talks about the basically human beings are good. Everybody is born with a little diamond inside that you just need to make shine, and yet collectively we're not able to do it. But there is no CEO in the world who wants more unemployment, more air pollution, or more people going to bed hungry. So you have to believe first and foremost in the inherent goodness of people. But their individual and collective behavior, as we've talked before, is often driven by the boundaries in which they operate. If the financial market or even governments are fairly short term in their cycles, then these CEOs are also short term. If their compensation systems, which unfortunately is the case, is short term, or the board puts short term pressure on them, their behavior is also short term. If there is no reward on return on environmental or social capital, they won't focus on that. The current system is a return on financial capital, and they're very good at optimizing that. But if you would also give them a mission to get a return on social and environmental capital, I think they're very well capable of doing this. So we need to change these boundaries to provide that freedom. We need to move financial markets, especially to the longer term, and make them subservient to the real economy again, versus the other way around. But one of the key things that we will discover is that we cannot solve the big challenges that we now have with the tools that we apply. We need to solve them at a different level than they've been created, not only by providing the space, longer term being the most important one, but more importantly also by working together differently. These things need to happen in partnerships that we've never seen before. Some of that started to work during COVID, but here we need civil society, governments, and the private sector to work together. We see that happening increasingly. So let's take agriculture, for example. We cannot solve all these issues and change our food supply chain, if you want, to our food or land use systems, if we don't find different ways of cooperating, different ways of spreading the value that is created across the value chain, different ways of connecting the signals. If you are a CEO of any of the companies right now, and you're being asked by consumers to move to regenerative cotton, for example, if you're in fashion or if you're in agriculture, there's no way you can do that. Even a company like Unilever doesn't have that size and scale, just as it doesn't have the size and scale to solve the world's issues of plastics in the oceans or depletion of our fish stocks. So we need to start working together differently, which starts with an aligned vision, which starts with some clear objectives and measurements, with timeframes, assigning of responsibilities and accountabilities, and then reorienting the disincentives that are now there into incentives to get there. And that's why we created Imagine. Imagine is a neutral platform where we bring a critical mass of CEOs across the value chain together by industry sector. We've brought together about 10% of the food sector. They're all working now on a common measurement for regenerative agriculture. They're concentrating themselves, all their joint efforts on certain geographies to really have an impact versus a scattered approach. They're setting up a data system, starting with obviously some measures that need to be qualified. What does soil health mean? What does carbon capture mean? What does restoring nature mean? What is livelihood measures that come with that? So we can create that with a critical mass and then hopefully get to consumer habit changes collectively, joint labeling programs, joint programs to have crop diversification. So if we get these CEOs together, what we find out is that collectively they actually become more courageous. There's a higher level of trust that is being built. Creative partnerships are being formed, and new solutions are being given. You take fertilizer, just take an example to make it come alive. You take fertilizer, it's a high carbon intensive product, and yet all the companies are making net zero commitments. So in the future, you'll make ammonia from hydrogen, and you have green fertilizers. But the cost of that probably is 10 times higher. But on the end product, it might be less than a cent. It's not that much, but the farmer is not able to pay 10 times more. But if you put the whole value chain together and you have this clear goal of making your value chain carbon neutral, if you want to, then all of a sudden with a group of people that have worked together, a trust level that is higher, partnerships are being formed that make these things possible. And this is exactly what we do with Imagine, to focus basically on climate change and inequality, but to accelerate that pace of change. And as I said, it's interesting to see that if you put these CEOs together on a neutral platform like that, and it's a foundation that we have created, but they do become more courageous and actually are setting the bar higher. They learn from each other, benchmark, but they set the bar higher. They expose themselves, they take some risks, they deal with the uncomfortable questions that you've been raising of things that otherwise don't get addressed. And for governments, it's also better. We now work, for example, with Europe, with Frans Timmermans, who's responsible for the Green Deal. Instead of each company knocking on his door and lobbying for their version of the label, we now have a critical mass of companies that say, let's work together and produce one label, because ultimately it's in our interest to have a common standard. And we move things forward at a speed that has never been seen before. So these are the type of partnerships that need to evolve. Good leadership, first and foremost, is not only to be a good human being, but it's also to put yourself to the service of others, knowing that by doing so, you're better off yourselves as well. And I think that is the point that we're getting at right now, that more and more understand that working this greater good, creating a company that's not only net positive, but also being actively involved in these broader transformations that change our systems, is actually ultimately to the benefit of their own companies as well. We see the same with the COVID vaccine. Some countries are playing the nationalistic game, and we've looked at that, and the cost to the global world is $9 trillion if we don't try to do this at the global level. The virus doesn't know any boundaries. You get mutations, you stifle supply chains, you keep other people in poverty with all the unintended consequences of that. So attacking these issues holistically, which is what you're saying, with a certain sense of solidarity as well, is a very important thing.
I'm going to take another question from our audience. And this one is from Peter Renhilton, who is here in New Zealand. And he says, when you talk about the actions need to be taken by farmers, and specifically those smallholder farmers and growers in developing countries, what support can be provided to them? Is there movement happening to provide either the capital, the knowledge, or both for them to start to shift towards more sustainable, more regenerative practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not fast enough is the answer, obviously, but as I mentioned, only the countries in this world have only put 3% of their spending by addressing our food systems and nature-based solutions, totally out of proportion to the benefit by spending more. What we're now trying to do with the Building Back Better, the 16 trillion and more money that is coming along, being sure that nature-based solutions are firmly on the agenda. Just 5% more spending towards our food systems would generate 7% more jobs, for example. And we're living at a time that we need more job creation than ever. One of the bigger issues we're going to face coming out of COVID is actually the issues of social cohesion. We've lost the equivalent of 500 million jobs. And if we don't address the issues of social cohesion, of just transition, of inclusion, you'll have more people in the streets, more people voicing their dissatisfaction in the polls, and you'll get more populism and nationalism. The second thing is that alliances are being formed. You'll see, for example, in the Earth Summit, that countries like Norway, the US, the UK have come together with significant amounts of money, including the private sector that have made billions of commitments to create an initiative which is called LEAVE. And LEAVE basically will pay you for protection of nature, will help the farmers actually reorient their businesses in getting paid for their services. And companies then commit to ensure that it goes well beyond their own climate commitments, but they also commit that they are fulfilling their commitments in their value chain and take from these farmers the products, etc. So initiatives like regenerative farming that are now happening in many parts of the world are basically collective initiatives that are working. The Food Summit has 5 action tracks that is being capably led by Agnes Kalabata from Nairobi in Kenya. And in these action tracks, it's worth looking at. Some of that is coming in the public right now, but most of that breakthrough that comes from that is from these broader partnerships that are coming on the agenda. Now, some countries are picking up earlier than others. Countries are starting to understand that as they have to submit their NDCs, their nationally determined commitments on climate change, as they start to look at the numbers, they realize they have to have nature-based solutions. Food and land use systems have to be part of that. And countries like Colombia, Japan, Ethiopia, and some of the others around the world are a little bit ahead. But I think we have a goal to get about 100 countries to commit behind the action steps coming out of the Food Summit. We might or might not get there, but I think you'll see a significant increase in countries putting this as a priority on their global agenda.
We have someone on this call who lives in the future. He writes a wonderful newsletter. And what he's wondering about is whether you have any thoughts on cryptocurrency, and specifically any thoughts on cryptocurrency tied to climate initiatives.
No, Kyla, you're kind enough to put it to me, but I'm humble enough to tell you that I'm not qualified to answer that question. The cryptocurrencies is an area that I've stayed away from. As far as swallowing a pill and solving your food problems, I think that's a solution for some people, but it's and there might be a market for someone for that, but I'm not so sure that this is where the solution is for the 10 billion people that we are going to have in the world. So we need to find still ways to ensure that we get the farmers to move from traditional techniques to more precise technologies and helping them with water and soil management. We need to get climate smart agriculture skilled up. We need to stop deforestation. There are many things that need to happen in the next 10 years that we're not going to replace by a little pill. Bill Gates put his book out on climate change, and Bill is a man driven by technology and innovation, and I don't disagree with that. But that's always been the case in the world. We've always had innovation. I could have had that same story 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And if that is the case, why do we still live in a world where actually more people are slipping back into poverty, where we're not addressing some of these basic issues of humanity that don't cost much money? 5 million children die every year of infectious diseases like pneumonia, diarrhea, that could be prevented with a piece of bar soap. So, technology is fine, and we always will want to have that. Carbon capture, battery technology, and I admire that. We need to invest in that. But where we are now, we are at a moral dilemma, much more than an innovation dilemma, to attack some of these issues in the world. Inequality doesn't need technology to address.
Paul, I'd like to ask you my final question, if I may. So you spoke about when you get the CEOs together they become more courageous. In my day job, I actually work with people to develop courage as a tangible and specific skill. And one of the things that we know is that courage is contagious. You also spoke about farmers getting maybe 50, 60 cycles and, taking a risk on being able to try a more regenerative style of farming or a more sustainable approach. That's a big bet if you only have 50 or 60 cycles. So, my question to you is, what role does courage play in all this, and how can we cultivate courage across not just leaders of major organizations, but across all of us so that collectively we can address these issues?
Yeah. And courage actually comes from the French word cœur. And the French word cœur is heart. You cannot be courageous if you just lead by the head. You have to lead with the head and the heart. That's where real courage comes in. It's as much about humanity, humility, compassion, empathy than anything else. And what COVID has shown is that leaders that are these true human beings that possess these qualities really have done better because they got a bigger following. They created the trust that was needed. They talked the truth. They cared about their people. And these companies have fared well during this incredible time of uncertainty and tragedy. So courage is more than that. Courage is also to expose yourself by working together. Many businesses don't want to work together. CEOs are on these pedestals. They take risk by exposing themselves, by working with people that might have slightly different objectives, yet combined, you would be in a better place. Power balances that might not be totally aligned, that they would feel uncomfortable with. So it does take a courage, does take a plunge into the uncertain. Most people operate by playing not to lose. That we simply cannot afford anymore. We need to run our companies now by playing to win. We certainly are up against time that requires that sense of urgency. And that also requires us to work much more openly, to be humble about what we know, what we don't know, to embrace partnerships that get us to answers or territories we've never been before, to make commitments that are more than what your PR department says you can deliver on, because you know these commitments are needed for humanity. That is really where courage comes in. And that courage is at every level. That has nothing to do with size. It's individuals that change this world. It's small communities that change this world. It's not just the big companies. That's a misconception. In fact, their bureaucratic structures and committees and all the things around that often prevent them from being more courageous. It's one of the reasons that the average lifetime of a publicly traded company in the US has gone down from 67 years to 17 years now. They're less courageous. It's also why an average tenure of a CEO of these big companies has dropped to less than 4.5 years. They're not equipped to deal with this. But where it really happens is in 95% of the economy everywhere in the world, which is the small and medium-sized enterprises, which is many people in your audience. As I said, they are creative, they're nimble, they are more connected with what society needs. I think that you have your cards better stacked than many of the bigger companies. Um, and solutions within reach, because you often don't need the entire systems to change to get to get to some of the things. For Nestle to get to regenerative agriculture, they have to change whole countries. Or in Unilever, when I wanted sustainable vanilla, I had to change Madagascar, while smaller companies can get their hands on sustainable sourcing from whatever the various B Corps are in the world that provide this. So you're at an advantage, you're not at a disadvantage. The only limitations you put on yourself are between these two things. It's how you think about it. If you think you can, you will, and if you think you can't, you also have the answer. So it is an attitude, is altitude in this regard. And I think you're well placed. And if you can't do it alone, go into trade associations, work with the UN Global Compact or the ICC, which has initiatives that enroll you in agriculture. There are many collectives that are starting to pop up where you collectively leverage your strengths to do something bigger than you would be alone capable of. So that journey starts with you and ends with you. Are you a true leader that puts the interest of others ahead of their own? And by doing so, you also would be better off yourselves. That's the journey you have to be on. And that's a journey of purpose, if you want to. Purpose is, passion is to do what you like, and purpose is to do what is needed, if you want to. The Dalai Lama, I think, said it well when the Dalai Lama said that if you seek enlightenment for yourself simply to enhance yourself and your position, you miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment for yourself to enable you to serve others, you are with purpose. And all I can encourage each and all of us is to lead a life with purpose. Most of the people that are on this call are very fortunate, despite the challenges that we have in our daily lives. But they're very fortunate. They're educated. They're probably financially more independent than many people in the world. They can live and work where they want to some extent. And, you belong to 5% of the world population that has that privilege. And it's basically you've won the lottery ticket of life by being born in a place that was right. Like I was born in the Netherlands. That's why I'm talking to you. But that's not the case for 95% of the world population. So if you belong to these 5%, I believe it's your duty, it's your obligation to put yourself to the service of the other 95%.
Paul, I could talk to you for 100 hours. I know we are out of time. I can't tell you what a gift this has been. It's been, for me, an absolute privilege and a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thanks for the time and the opportunity.
Thank
And
you.
good
Looking
luck.
forward to connecting. Thank you so much.
Like-
Have a great day.
like-